All right, we got to hit Pac-12 and make sure I finish before the show ends. But you can keep searching. Let's throw up the first graphic. I'm going to just start getting into it. But hometown conference. I am a UCLA fan. I did graduate with my master's degree from the University of Utah, so there might be a little bias coming in. But we will start with the great state of Oregon. I should have asked Bob if he was liking the Ducks this year. They actually grade out pretty high for me. So they're not my 8th best ranked team in the country. Now, it's pretty much a tie with them and LSU and Wisconsin and Penn State. They're all within about a point of each other for what it's worth. So if you want to say, oh, wow, they're 8th, look, they could be 11th or 12th, and it wouldn't. Sure, fair argument. But as a whole, I am a little more bullish than I think others are. I think in general, it's going to come down to Anthony Brown, the transfer from Boston College at quarterback. Can he take over for Tyler Shuck? Shout out to the Shuck family. I think the skepticism is okay, but when you have an offensive line that returns 100% of its production, you have, is it CJ Verdell is just like a speedster. I think he's only 5'7", which, by the way, is it harder to tackle as a defensive back?
I hate
the fastest that are shorter.
Like guarding smaller guys for me was horrible.
It's rough.
Quicker.
Right. He's so fast, but then he's short, and you don't get the same.
You can't get hands on him. And if you don't touch him and slow him down, you're toast.
No one can tackle the guy. It's ridiculous. So they have him. They also have 4 really highly touted, rated receivers. And Anthony Brown at Boston College, who very infrequently ran RPO at Boston College, graded out extremely well when they did run RPO. And that's what Joe Moorhead does from Mississippi State, Penn State prior to that. He's the offensive coordinator at Oregon. That's what they generally run for the Ducks. So I just think the setup for Anthony Brown with the defense that's elite as well. I think they have a top 2 secondary, and let me pull it up actually, just so I'm not incorrect. Defensive line for sure. They bring back a strong. Let me have the wrong tab. Yep, top defensive line in the Pac-12, secondary. So you have a defense that expects to improve and an offense that I think has a ton of upside. Now, I will say this, getting back to that same point we were making with Ty, minus 110s on the board to win the North. You can get plus 110. So that's like a 5% difference, which is actually the difference, in my opinion, of it being a worthwhile bet. If you can get, there's, I think, 3 books in the U.S. that offer plus 110. I would bet that at minus 110. It's pretty close to fair considering their toughest opponent in the North is going to be Washington. They play them on the road. Oregon still projects to be a small favorite there. But as a whole, I think that's the difference of whether it's a worthwhile bet. And the 9, even though I feel like I'm bullish on Oregon, I'm 9.2. The 9's pretty much fair. I wouldn't be betting it unless you can get an 8.5 that's reasonably priced. USC, a team that I generally feel like has way more talent and just underachieves and underperforms over and over. You can say that about Clay Helton just ever since he's gone there. Last year, their offense with Slovis, year 2, who was awesome as a freshman, air raid style offense, they were absolutely pathetic in the red zone. They couldn't finish drives. I think their offense finished just barely in the top 60 in a lot of the metrics from being one that projected to be a top 10 offense. Now, can they figure that out with all the talent USC brings to the table? Can Helton and Slovis figure it out? I don't know, but if they do, they have a ton of upside. I think defensively, Todd Orlando came in and actually they had a top 25 defense in a lot of the metrics, and people kind of forgot about Todd Orlando. When he was at Utah State, they were elite. Then he follows Tom Herman to Houston, really good. Then he goes to Texas, and it was a mess. And people blame Orlando for that. Maybe it was his fault, but look, he goes to USC last year, and the defense improved dramatically. So I think their defense will be similarly good, and there is upside on the Trojans if they can figure out the scoring issues. I project them, let me pull this other tab back up, I believe 9 wins. So at 8.5, if you can get, I know it's weird because I'm about to get into Utah. It's weird betting overs on 2 teams in the same division, but my numbers like USC. Their out-of-conference schedule sets up pretty routinely. There's nothing too crazy. Like Oregon, for example, plays Ohio State out of conference. That's a little tougher. But I like the 8.5s on USC. So hopefully Slovis and Helton can figure out scoring when they're inside the red zone. They get into a top 10 offense. I think they're going to have a top 25-ish defense. And with the schedule, that gets them to 9+ wins. Now, Utah, he has an 8 on the board. There are not too many 8s left. This is the difference again for me. I bet the 8s that, for example, BetMGM has minus 150. I'd bet the minus 150s on the 8s. I wouldn't bet the 8.5s that are minus 140. I think it's moved some even just the past week or so since I was starting to do some more Pac-12 work last week. I like Utah. It's similar type of upside with the offense that brings back a ton of weapons after. Look, Coach Whittingham, by the way, just ridiculously consistent. Defensively, offensively, they always have some of the best fronts on each side of the ball. I believe they also bring back 100% of their offensive line play from last year, but they've been shuffling through quarterbacks. They get Charlie Brewer transferring in from Baylor, who I think has the best arm of any of these QBs that have tried to play for Utah. And they've still done well despite the lack of quarterback play and the ability to really throw the football consistently. So you add that to a run game, weapons around them at wide receiver and tight end, and a defense that's just always going to be elite. I think there's a ton of upside for Utah. Believe it or not, a month ago, I actually was able to bet them at 17-1 to win the conference. Now the best price you can get is 7-1. Like, it was just completely, people were just behind on the Utah thing. I don't know what it was. There was a 14-1 and a 17-1, and those are long gone. So I wouldn't suggest chasing and betting 6 or 7-1 now. Definitely not that. But I do think if you can get the 8s at a few of the spots that have it at minus 150 or better, that's a worthwhile play. Over, I am 8.8 wins projected, and just the 7 and 5 are worse with their schedule set up. Just doesn't happen very frequently. Last but not least, Washington, a team that's right in that mix with Utah. They're a few spots lower. By the way, I have Utah, I believe 15th, Washington at 21st. So these are 4 teams that are almost in my top 20, but at least top 25. And Washington, it was a weird year. I think they only played 4 games. It's a weird COVID season, and Jimmy Lake took over. It was his first season, so it was even extra weird because Chris Peterson left, and he had been doing stuff with the defensive he's like a co-defensive coordinator, I believe. So the thought was, oh, well, he'll step right in. Everything will be okay. Maybe that's the case. The problem is that they had a weird year where they couldn't prep, and they just jump into a few games, and Dylan Morris was the true freshman quarterback who was really good on short throws. He graded out elite on play-by-play data at PFF, but he graded out really below average on intermediate and deep throws. So can they figure out an offense where Dylan Morris, now with a real off season, his second season, if you want to even count 4 games as the first season? I'm skeptical. I think a lot of people, I believe Phil Steele has Washington like in his top 12 or 13. And it was one of his main surprise teams. He always does his surprise teams of the year. I think Washington was his number 1 surprise team. Look, they have a great secondary. The defense actually fell off, and I'm now a little bit, I think they lost the defensive coordinator that was calling the plays to Texas. And Jimmy Lake's there, and it's like, oh, well, they'll be okay. I actually have some question marks on the defensive side, along with Morris at quarterback. I'm a little more bearish Washington. I'm not enough to bet 8.5. But again, enough that I think even though they get the home matchup against Oregon, Oregon's a tier better than the Huskies. And so I like Oregon at plus money to win the division in the North. And yeah, that wraps it up, man. I think we're good.